Okay, I'll hook into it. So thank you to our first speaker. It was really interesting to see priorities and really good opportunities, I think, for collaboration with Vietnam. And thanks also to Margaret because she's really covered the ground here well. And I'm going to expand on some of the opportunities and just maybe flesh a few of them out a little bit in this presentation. So first of all, just to reinforce what Margaret said, in Australia, agriculture is responsible for 16.8% of our emissions. So it's quite an important sector. A majority of that, in fact, about 70% is from grazing livestock, and particularly beef and sheep. And this is the place where it's actually really hard to reduce emissions. So as Margaret said, this is a focus for a lot of us. The other big challenge here is any solution we come up with has to be low cost. Otherwise, it's not going to be profitable or even cost neutral for the farmers that we're asking to adopt these solutions. And one of our big cattle companies, pastoral companies, has given us a target of any solution must cost less than 20 cents per day per animal, because otherwise the reductions in emissions and the carbon credits they can claim for that don't offset the cost of the intervention to lower the emissions. So they've given us this quite a difficult target, but it's good to know where we have to aim of less than 20 cents per day per animal for any intervention. So the interventions or the method for reducing emissions that are closest to market and are in fact being used by some companies now in their feedlots are these feed additives that Margaret talked about, 3-nop, which is a chemical, and asparagopsis, which is a seaweed that when fed to animals, to cattle, can reduce methane emissions by 30 to 90%, depending on how much is fed and in what circumstances. So these are real live ways that people can reduce methane. They work particularly well in feedlots because it's easy to deliver. There are still questions about cost effectiveness. And the real question is, as Margaret said, how do you deliver these additives in an extensive environment? The other, I guess, challenge is you have to deliver these to animals every day, all the time to get these large reductions as well. So very good solutions, but we need other solutions as well. And something else that is emerging is they're perhaps not the silver bullet. In some circumstances, like a feedlot, they might be able to reduce methane emissions by 90%. But when you look at a grazing situation, it might be more like 30 to 40%. So you need something else as well. So genomic selection, genetic and genomic selection is another pathway. So this is where you have measurements of methane emissions on animals. You also have them genotyped for DNA markers, and you link up those DNA profiles to the level of emissions. And you look for low methane emission level DNA profiles. The amount of methane emissions that cattle have is a heritable trait. In other words, part of it is genetic. It's about, from a lot of experiments done by us and around the world, it's about 20% genetic, and that's great. That means we can make selection progress on that trait with that level of heritability. A challenge is it is expensive to measure. At the moment, we're measuring it with this device you can see in the picture called a green feed unit. The cattle are on pasture, but they have to walk up to this machine, stick their head in the machine, and the machine measures the amount of methane they're burping off. That's an expensive process to measure cattle with the device. At the moment, MLA is funding us to measure about 12,000 cattle across a couple of years to set up the reference population where we have both DNA marker profiles done and the methane measurements made, so we can use DNA markers after that to screen for animals with low methane emissions and genetically low methane emissions and breed from them. So this is perhaps a low-risk strategy because we've used genomic selection for so many other traits and it's worked successfully. It's very likely to work as long as we measure enough animals. It's going to be a perhaps slow process, but cumulative. So after a number of generations of selection, we'll be able to make a real impact on methane emissions. And it's also a low-cost solution because you just have to select out and breed from the animals that have low methane emissions. This is a solution being pursued very actively in Ireland, also in Australia and also in Europe. And for grazing livestock, it's a good solution. As I said, it does require large reference populations of genotyped and phenotyped animals, so animals measured for methane. And we're setting ourselves up with various projects to do that. I just want to point out as well that selection for other traits can also reduce methane emissions in the system. Feed conversion efficiency, there's quite a good correlation between feed conversion and methane emissions. So the more efficient animals emit less methane. So that's a double win because you can have more beef produced for the same amount of feed and also less methane. Selection for improved fertility can also improve or reduce farm system emissions. If you can improve fertility, you dilute the cow's methane emissions over more calves, over more kilograms of beef. So when you talk about the farm system, anything you can do to improve efficiency tends to reduce methane emissions. And that can be quite a substantial effect. Other solutions getting a little bit more perspective now, but there is some evidence that if you can alter the rumen of an animal early in life to be a low emitting rumen, that alteration can actually persist for quite a few number of years after you've made that early alteration. So for example, you can feed young animals things like feed additives that reduce methane emissions. That can set the rumen up, if you do it at the right time, to be a low methane emitting rumen for quite a number of years into the future. So that's a very exciting area because it's potentially low cost, but more research in that area is required. There's one really good experiment that shows that's possible, and that result is shown in the graph here, but there's more research to be done there. And then lastly, on the interventions you can make that really do have an impact on emissions, incorporating legumes and pastures that reduce methane can reduce emissions from the system by 10 to 15%. So, for example, incorporating leucaena, which is a plant that can be grazed by cattle, a legume that can be grazed by cattle, can reduce farm systems emissions quite considerably. Something else we're looking into quite actively is selection or gene editing of pastures to reduce emissions. So, for example, as the first speaker alluded to, if you can increase the tannin content of the pasture, you might be able to do that by gene editing. you can reduce emissions from the livestock that graze that pasture. And that potentially is quite a low cost way of reducing emissions. So quite exciting. So just to conclude this part of the talk, we really do have in our array of technologies, I guess, some very promising and some that are actually on the market already, technologies that can reduce methane emissions, and some that are in a scale-up phase, being scaled up to a farm systems level, and there are others that are more prospective. I think it's really important to think about the cost profile of these technologies. Our pastoral company that we work with gave us this target of less than 20 cents a day, but we really need to think about our farmers adopting this technology. For them, it must be profitable or at the very least cost neutral to be adopted. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that to get to net zero, no one technology is going to get us there. I think we're faced with a future where we have to think about stacking technologies together in a farm system to get to net zero. And that leads me nicely onto the last part of this presentation, which is about a very large project that we've put together in Australia, and we're just waiting on the funding announcement for now, where we have the opportunity to do things like stack lots of technologies together or multiple technologies together on demonstration farms to see how far we can push the beef industry towards net zero. So this is our zero net emissions from agriculture cooperative research centre. And a cooperative research centre is an Australian scheme where industry and research gets together and say, we really need a big program of work in a particular area to have a big impact. And that's exactly what happened here. Industry, our agricultural industries, and the researchers got together, worked out a bit of a pathway to get to net zero, and then discussed both the research required and the demonstration required to get ag industries to adopt these pathways. So just to give you a flavour for who's in this CRC, all the state governments in Australia, so Australia has different states, different governments. Each of those states has Department of Agriculture. They're all involved in this large bid. We also have about 54 private companies, ranging from beef production companies that have lots of farms around the country, right through to supermarkets who are interested in selling net zero beef, for example. There's banks in there, ag tech companies, Indigenous land organisations as well. So Aboriginal enterprises that own pastoral companies and so on. There's about 8 or 9 universities across Australia have come together. And we also have farmer groups and natural resource management groups. So these are, if you can work with these groups, it's a very good way to get adoption because they have large numbers of farmers in those groups. And a really key part of this CRC, this program, is going to be producer demonstration sites around the country that demonstrate methane and greenhouse gas mitigation technologies and stack them together, so combine them together to see how far we can go to net zero. And these producer demonstration sites, they were inspired by the work that MLA has done in this area. MLA has demonstrated these are very effective ways of getting adoption of technologies. So just to give you a really quick insight into the research that's actually going on, we have a plant program. A big part of that is about these pastures that reduce emissions through gene editing, through breeding, and so on. In the animal space, we need more work on how do we measure individual animal methane measurements. We have these green feed devices, but they're a bit cumbersome. So part of our work is going to be how do we come up with new ways of measuring animal individual methane measurements, and that's going to be together with the ag tech sector. We're going to build on the work that MLA has funded in selection for low emission livestock, ramp that up and expand it out. Also look at these technologies to manipulate the rumen, so they're low emitting rumens over the animal's lifetime. There's another part here as well, which is about looking at native shrubs and grasses. Some of them will have methane mitigating compounds. How can we incorporate them into the farming system? Then program 3 is really about the whole farm enterprise benchmarking and carbon footprinting, so that businesses can demonstrate what their footprint is. Again, this work expands on what Margaret was talking about. Also looking at requirements from overseas. So if the EU says, we have to have this and this in your carbon accounting, how do you incorporate that into the systems we're setting up? And that's really important for maintaining market access. And then also as part of that program, trade off with other emerging priorities like biodiversity maintenance. And then just finally, program 4 is looking at life cycle analysis. So across the whole supply chain, where are the key points where you can reduce emissions, and also intersects with other big things that are happening in the emissions reduction space. So renewable energy, hydrogen, and so on. And just finally, there's also a great education program as part of the CRC to train a lot of the next generation of researchers in low emission technologies. How do you set them up on farm? How do you work with that across the supply chain, and so on? So I'll stop there, but look forward to any suggestions and opportunities for collaboration. If this CRC is successful, we'll really be looking for collaboration across the globe. So it's a great opportunity. So thank you.